welcome to episode 7 of the D-Noise podcast, the season 1 finale. You probably know by now that we're the Blender heads at CG Cookie, here to discuss all things pertaining to computer graphics and its premier open source software, Blender. It's not a secret that Blender's popularity is growing every year. We're seeing more professionals try it out and often stick with it. We're even seeing some studios adopt it. So the community often asks, what is Blender's place in the industry, both now and what will it be in the future? Related to this, I also wonder how healthy the relationship is between the Blender community and industry professionals. To discuss this important topic, we've invited two very special guests, Henning and Morten from Flip Normals. They are bona fide industry pros, having worked on blockbuster films, while also having a foot in the Blender world as instructors. We also have Jason Van Gumster, who is something of a Blender legend. He goes way back to the time before Blender was even open source. He wrote the book Blender for Dummies, and he's also used Blender professionally for many years. Lastly, and arguably the least, I'm Kent Trammell. Let's get into it. Welcome, gentlemen. It is an honor to have each of you here today. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I think it's an important conversation to have, especially face-to-face rather than on social media. The timing of this is on the heels of a recent Twitter debate I think we're probably familiar with about Blender's selection method, which started as a very thoughtful, critical analysis from an industry professional, but after some back and forth devolved into something kind of uglier. Now, I'm not trying to dive deep into that debate specifically. Rather, I would say it's the latest interaction that makes me wonder, or maybe affirms my suspicion that maybe there's some bad blood between the industry and the Blender community. And if so, I think that's a shame. I think both sides can do better. There's a lot to consider about this topic. Personal experiences, long standard industry software, Blender's place in the industry. But at the core, I think we're talking about passionate artists creating within a complex art form with a steep learning curve and the tools that enable them to do so. And that is going to produce very strong opinions and biases, which don't always result in the most well-rounded perspectives. But that's enough of a preface. As I'm sure you heard in the intro, we have with us Henning and Morten from Flip Normals. I'm excited that you are part of this conversation. We have been, kind of cordial competitors for years, and we're finally doing something together. And so thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's very exciting. We've been following you guys for years as well. So it's a real pleasure to finally meet more face-to-face than just over a Twitter handle and an avatar there.
Yeah, I think I've spoken with Jonathan over the past 2 or 3 years just on Twitter and support emails here and there. So it's nice to meet someone from the team face-to-face as well.
Thank you. And we also have Jason Van Gumster, who is, I consider, like a wise old sage in the Blender community. He started using it back in 97, 98 and has seen it transition to open source. So he goes way back, but also with Orange Turbine helps onboard Blender for studios. So together, I think we can have a pretty well-rounded conversation about this topic. To get started, I wondered if we could spend a few minutes discussing our backgrounds.
Yeah, sure. I started with 3D when I was 16 years old. I just turned 32, so that's officially more than half my life. So both Morten and I have been doing this for quite some time at this point. Started with 3D Studio Max, then went into Modo. ZBrush has always been there on the side. A little bit of XSI, then Softimage and Maya, and now actually moved most of my stuff over to Blender, which is really cool. So Blender is actually my main tool at the moment, along with obviously ZBrush, Substance Painter, Photoshop, all that kind of stuff. Professionally, I worked mostly at NBC in London and then at DNEG later on. So I was working as a character modeler and texture artist and a little bit of a concept sculptor as well on a lot of cool stuff there. Some stuff was like Alien Covenant, Pirates of the Caribbean. Then at DNEG, the biggest one was Pacific Rim, where both Morten and I worked together, where we were doing kaijus. So that was really cool. And then for the last 5 years now, we've been doing Flip Normals full-time. That's been our life for the last many years. We started Flip Normals officially 10 years ago, so it's a long journey, October 2013, and then full-time since June 2018.
Excellent. Morten?
I beat Henning by a year by starting with 3D when I was 15. I just wanted to get that out there to begin with. But I started with 3D Studio Max as well, and slowly picked up some stuff in ZBrush, but majority was just doing things in 3ds Max, a lot of ArcViz stuff. And later on moved into Maya, played around with Rhino for a bit as well in the early days. Over the past couple of years, started to incorporate Blender And sort of the same story as with Henning. I mean, Blender and ZBrush are my two main 3D packages now. I can do everything I really need to do with Blender. Aside from the sculpting part, I prefer to do that in ZBrush, but everything else really just takes place in Blender now. And professionally, it's a very similar story. I worked in London as well, same as Henning. I worked for Cinesite, Framestore, and DNEG over there, and worked on, just a bunch of things. One of the Fantastic Beasts, Harry Potter films, Pacific Rim 2. I actually also worked on Pacific Rim 1, but that was just doing cables. It's many, many years ago. So a lot of different film projects, and then we slowly transitioned into working full-time in FlippedNormals, and that has been our pet project and full-time job for, like Henning said, for the past 5 years.
I invited you guys because I think you're an interesting duo that we don't have a lot of, which is you have the proper industry experience, and by proper I mean biggest studios, biggest films that we all know and love, and at a high level as well, being character artists. So the fact that you have a foot in the Blender camp, and Henning, you mentioned that's kind of your main package now, I think you can bring a voice to the industry side of this conversation that I'm losing touch with. My history is I was 15, maybe 14, not that I want to be first. But let's say 15, I started to get into computer graphics as a teenager. And then I went to school at Full Sail and then quickly went into the industry. I was in the industry for about 3 years working at a pair of studios and worked on one feature animation, which was called Freebirds. It was not good. And then promptly got out to work with CG Cookie teaching Blender. As far as the software, I kind of became a big fan of the commercial software in college. I kind of collected them. I had to do something in each of the softwares. So at the first studio, I started with Maya, transitioned to Max, started with ZBrush, went to Mudbox, and then Mental Ray to V-Ray, and then back to a Maya pipeline when I joined RealFX, and then switched to Blender not too long after joining RealFX, used it at the studio as my main tool in the modeling department. And then started teaching Blender. So that's what I've been doing for 10 years. But mathematically, I think that's 3 years versus 10 years, in favor of the Blender community, hopefully with a little bit of connection still to that industry perspective. And then Jason, I kind of spoke for you earlier, but tell us something about yourself.
Well, as the old man of the... sorry. I started with 3D way back when, but I actually did a lot of my training stuff in Softimage. At the time, I was doing a lot more stuff, especially Unix and Linux-related stuff, and I couldn't get that on that machine, so I started doing more and more with Blender at that time, and that's when I started seeing that back in 97, 98. I appreciate you saying old sage. I think Ton would refer to me as a Blender old fart, but that's just, Ton terminology. And so I spent a lot of my time working in Blender and doing those sort of things. A lot of my projects were done in that. Then upon graduation, I actually started an animation studio in Richmond, Virginia, doing small stuff, really local TV shows, TV commercials, mostly commercials, and industrial visualization. And so I was doing that kind of stuff in the area. And then after 8 years of doing that, I got an offer to apply 3D in a way that is uncommon. I worked for 8 years in the currency design industry. I was designing anti-counterfeit security for currency. I'm actually still doing some of that stuff now because it's hard to find people to do it and they wouldn't let me stop, which is fun because it's a sandbox that no one else gets to play with. But I was using 3D tools in Blender to do a lot of that work because the actual production of that sort of stuff is really expensive. And so like animation, it takes the farther down the pipe it gets, the more expensive it gets to do. So previs is huge. Blender got used a lot as a design tool in that particular space that I was in. In the course of doing all of that, I built render farms and did a lot of pipeline integration in places where it didn't seem like it made sense to before. Now it does. And so some of that experience and stuff got migrated over. And what I'm doing now is helping, as part of Orange Turbine, studios and tool makers actually have better integration with Blender so that from the studio standpoint, Blender fits into a pipeline with other tools more nicely, and you can develop and automate things for that more conveniently. And then on the tool maker side, you have, all these other applications that actually Blender's being used. It's not going away. They've finally discovered this. And so they want to be able to integrate with Blender, get data out of Blender and into these other applications and vice versa. Sometimes that means training their staff. Sometimes that means actual software development. And so that's sort of in a nutshell where I am these days.
Well, do you think it was fair of me to say that maybe there's some bad blood between industry and Blender community?
When I was in the industry, it wasn't really so much bad blood. It was more that people in the industry didn't really care about it. There wasn't really any negative thoughts on it. It was just it's just not a professional tool that we can be using at this point. most people working in like the big studios, they don't really care about what tool you're using. You're constantly switching tools. Like if you're working in like shot production, you've been going between like now learning Maya or using Maya's domain tool to now Houdini, and you'll be using Katana, and like you're just using all sorts of stuff. So when people are like mentioning Blender there, people are just really more apathetic towards it because it's so far away from being able to be used in like, at least the big VFX houses. I see a little bit on the other side where a lot of people in the Blender community, they don't really have professional experience. They don't really know what's going on inside the big studios. So they can just assume things that have no grounding in the truth. I saw this same in like the Modo community like about 10 years ago, where you're seeing a feature in the software. You're seeing like, oh, this is a new lighting tool. This is incredible. I'm sure the big studios are going to love this kind of stuff. But they don't really care, the big studios. It's not because the feature isn't really cool. It's just because it's a whole pipeline of tools being together, which is a much, much bigger discussion than just, is this tool better or is it not? It's just, you're just not going to change your pipeline because of that. So on the fringes, I'm sure there is. I'm sure you have people in the industry who absolutely despise Blender and think of it as a complete joke. And you have people in the Blender community who think the professionals have no idea what they're doing and that they're using completely antiquated tools. But I think the problem is, if you see the debate through the eyes of social media, particularly Twitter, it amplifies the angriest voices. When you speak to real people who work in studios and use the tools, they're like, yeah, Blender is pretty cool. Use it at home. It's pretty nice. My license ran out. I can't afford $3,000 a year. So yeah, I use it at home. I work. I use like Katana or I use Houdini. But yeah, it's a cool tool. It's a bit quirky. It's a bit weird, but pretty cool that I get to do 3D at home. So my view is more like, I guess, a bit more wholesome. Is there like bad blood? At the end of the day, for me, not really. If you look at it a little bit more holistically than just like Twitter warfare between like a few angry voices here and there.
Yeah, I agree with Henning. It's like, especially when it comes to software loyalty, like my position has always been, who cares? I mean, whatever tool helps you get the job done is what you're going to use. I think one of the biggest disconnects that I see when it comes to Blender and this whole industry standard talk is that it seems like there's an expectation, especially, when 2.8 came out, revamp, new tools, nice UI, everyone sort of could get on board with it. I feel like the sentiment was very much like, okay, Blender's going to take over. And I think that's a misunderstanding from people who don't have industry experience, where they think that because Blender is a pretty well-rounded tool, we sculpting, sim, animation, modeling, it can do a lot of things. I think there's been an expectation that is like it would replace everything, where that couldn't be further from the truth. We have so many specialized tools for very specific tasks in each step of the pipeline. And often you have custom tools, custom pieces of software that's been written by a studio to solve one particular job. I mean, from my point of view, where Blender is now, it fits in perfectly in the pipeline for a specific artist that can speed up their workflow by using part of Blender, and then they'll send it off to whatever, if they need to do some rendering, back to Blender, off to ZBrush, and not having it be like this wonder package that can replace Maya, ZBrush, Houdini, Clarice for rendering, whatever it is, but it fits in as just another piece of the puzzle.
What you said there was really good about the expectations thing, because there's actually just two parts to this for me, at least. One is on both sides of it, if we're going to say that there are sides. On we'll say the Blender fanboy side is that Blender's going to take over the world, and it's like the next best thing in the world, and it's going to be great. And that's an unrealistic expectation. It doesn't align with the way the world works, just like you said. On the flip side of things, I would say that the Blender community and maybe Blender development in general has not done a great job of serving those expectations in terms of how the process works in terms of development. Like the whole open source ecosystem stuff, it's still fairly new when it comes to studio interaction with it. I mean, you have things like the ASWF and those sort of things happening, but they're still on thinking libraries. They're not thinking about the actual tool. And so when you have this thing like the Select debacle, the solution there is partially done right. Here's my proposal. But then the rest of it is, whether or not somebody agrees with you, it's kind of on you to produce it, right? You're not talking to a company and doing a feature request or a bug report. You're proposing something and you're suggesting work to be done. And if there's no one available to do it, which often there isn't, you kind of have to be the one to facilitate that. Getting studios or even individual artists to understand that it's not that transactional behavior that we're all used to in the commercial software world. there's more ownership, which was the second thing I was kind of getting into, is that this legacy within the Blender community is, I think, partially born from where it came from, right? Blender was literally liberated by its community. We bought it. We feel like we own it. It can be interpreted very easily as loyalty to the software, but it's not loyalty to the software as much as it's our baby, especially for those of us that have been in it for a long time. And so there's a sense of ownership, and it's not rational sometimes the responses that people do to it, because just like some folks have really ugly babies, and it's on us within the community and anyone doing it to foster and facilitate the development of beautifying our baby.
I am glad, Jason, that you went to the physical beauty of children. That's actually where I want to focus on.
I think that's pretty true. It's like, if you think about this from a industry perspective, take Maya as an example. Early days, studios started to implement it. It was very sort of fringe, right? So you write some tools, you had some melt scripts, maybe you didn't even have Python support, so you would just write whatever you could. But you were dealing with a shitty piece of software that couldn't do much, or like maybe you didn't even have Undo at the time, I don't know. But you kind of made do with the tools that you had. And then over the course of 20 years, you refined the tool and you refined your custom tools to integrate nicely with this tool, which then over time developed as well. You're going to have to do the same with Blender. And that just takes time. If you're even interested in that as a studio, if you spent 15 years building up a solid pipeline that is connected to one big piece of software, that's also a consideration whether or not you want to start switching over to something like Blender.
Especially if you've written custom pipeline tools that anticipate a bug, and when they fix the bug, all of a sudden all your tools break.
Yeah.
I'm conflicted because the foundation, I think we actually all agree on, which is where I hoped we would kind of nicely wrap up.
Let's disagree a little bit.
Yeah, like you said, Henning, like there's a few loud voices that make some of these perspectives seem broader than they actually are. And the majority are probably the more wiser and maybe holding the tongue. I'm somewhere in between. I can't tell you how many software war tweets I have started typing and then deleted, thankfully. But it's such a temptation. And we're talking about software preference. And Jason, you mentioned within the Blender community, there's this kind of sense of ownership. I think that's especially reserved for the Blender community that has this history of liberating it, like you say. And one of the criticisms I would bring forth to both sides, I think it's maybe more toward the Blender sides, but I think it's on both, is that this is a very complex art form. It's a steep learning curve. And when you break through that learning curve and you're able to actually understand the tools and use it to do what you want, I think naturally you're going to develop an appreciation for the software. Where I think it kind of gets a little weird is when that appreciation becomes affection. I think that really throws things out of whack. And obviously with the Blender community, there's this sense of a cult following. When you come from that, when you are very into that side of things, it makes sense to follow Blender almost for what it is, even if you don't aspire to create it. But like, I see Blender as a tool, a means to an end. The software ultimately doesn't matter. I'm hearing that coming from you guys as well. So how can the Blender community enjoy that ownership, but not let it spill over in negative ways?
There's two parts to that, right? Because it comes as part of the fact that Blender is open source. There's a lot of like pragmatic and practical benefits to that, but there's Blender as software, and then there's Blender as a movement, right? And this is where that taking over mindset can seep in when it maybe oughtn't. It's not just that the software is good, but that the methodology for producing it, people think of it as superior, right? They look at that as like, this is the way software should be developed because it's out in the open and we can make modifications to it. I don't have to ask anybody. If I want to use Blender to play music and mix audio, because I could do that, no one can stop me. But it's also what your own personal feelings are and ethics and morals and those sort of things. So I'm a very big open source guy. Everything that I do is with open source tools, and that's sort of part of the makeup of my nature. I don't expect anybody else to do that, though. I want other people to see the value in it that I see in it. I think the problem is when you have, sort of just go back to what Morten was saying, when you have that expectation that your way is the right way. And this happens on the other way with like somebody who's entrenched with a particular UI, and this way is the right way, and the fact that Blender doesn't do it the right way makes it inherently wrong or unusable. It's a two-way street, right? And so it really is about understanding what those expectations are and realizing that most of our expectations are our own expectations, and we shouldn't really sort of project those on other people.
I think that the whole open source nature is Like me jumping to Blender or sort of like incorporating it in my workflow had nothing to do with it being open source. Like open source is never something I've actively thought of. Like if I come across a tool, open source, oh cool, there are possibilities here that there wouldn't be with another tool. That's something that I've discovered through Blender, something that I really appreciate, that anyone can take anything, improve upon it, and if enough people agree, cool, let's implement it into the main branch. That's something I think is fantastic, because I think a perfect example of that was Pablo's sculpting branch. And Henning and I, we talked a lot about that publicly as well, in videos as well, really tried to push that to make sure that Blender, I'm not going to take credit for anything with the sculpting thing, but I really wanted it to improve. And I think it really did. For me, it still doesn't get me close to the feeling in ZBrush, but I think it's amazing that I have tools where I can sculpt in Blender and I can sculpt some nice stuff. But the open source thing, I think it's like, how do you combat the whole like you versus me thing? I think it's almost like a philosophical thing. It's a human nature thing, right? Where it's an age-old thing, my clan versus your clan, PlayStation versus Xbox, open source versus non-open source, Blender versus Maya. I don't have a solution for it because I think it's just people, but I hope that with time, with more and more people discovering it and discovering the strengths of it, that it can just be more commonplace instead of like, oh yeah, you have to use this, you have to use that, or you have to use it in a specific way.
I think that in the 3D industry in general, you can have like three kinds of people. You have the ones who maybe went to school to study game dev or films because they thought it was cool. They just liked the idea of making games, or they just like making cool stuff for movies, and they don't really care what tools they're using. They just truly care about the end product. Does the model look good, or does the game look good, and all that? And then you use whatever tool works. If you've been given Max, cool, you just learn Max. If you have to paint with Painter, fine, whatever. And then you have the second category. That's more where I am. I just think 3D is cool. I don't really do 3D to express myself or anything. I just genuinely find 3D to be awesome in terms of technical tools. I often sit down and just like do little tests and just like fiddle with it. I'm kind of like a tinkerer when it comes to it. I also like to create characters like in ZBrush, right? But I just fundamentally find 3D to be awesome. And then you have the third one, and that's a dangerous one. Those are the ones who enjoy the tool for the sake of the tool. And this is what I saw a lot in not the Blender community, but the Modo community first. It was people who they were really, really into Modo. And this exact same thing happens in Blender, where they're not thinking, okay, how can I make the coolest character or the coolest environment or something like that? They're simply being like, well, here is the tool, here is a framework for the tool, like the defense post of it. What can I do with that? So for instance, if you were to say like before, like 3.5, which has upgraded hair tools now, if you were like a Blender guy there and you just love the tools and you made characters, before that, you just would not touch hair and fur. You just wouldn't really tempt that because the tools just weren't good enough. And then suddenly you can, and now you're like, oh cool, I can make hair in my characters. But if you're like, well, I want to make a cat in 3D, and that's the end goal, then you just have to use whatever tools you need. You need ZBrush for sculpting, you probably need like XGen or the hair tool in Maya, or you need Houdini for the groom there. And that's just what you need. Like, it doesn't really matter what tool you're using for that. The second one here, the tinkerer and the one who does it to create a game or something, they're professionals, in meaning that they're not necessarily doing it for themselves, particularly if you're doing it for other people. You just need to get the job done. You're getting paid to make like a cat or a bear or something. And you just have to deliver that. You have to deliver it in shot. And then you're going to be kind of software agnostic in terms of your preference. Well, you might have tools you enjoy more than others, but you're not going to go, okay, I'm going to use Blender and I'm going to get as far as I possibly can in Blender, just because there are tools that are just much more suited to that. In the same way that there are a lot of scenarios where Blender is by far the most suited tool. Like for instance, for concept art, I think Blender is like the most powerful tool ever made for concept art, like bar none. Like ZBrush is cool, but like Blender is just on a whole different level where you can just knock something out real quick. You can use the scoping tools, block something out, some kind of environment, interactively model in a viewport, GPU, acceleration, all that kind of stuff. It's incredibly powerful. But there is a bit of a friction between these two when you basically have two big circles of people using it at the same time. You have the ones who love the tool, then you have the ones that are truly do not care about the tool, that just want to do cool stuff. And there is friction between those two just inherently. And you can't really fix that because their end goal is completely different.
I am, again, very encouraged by what I'm hearing because, it gives me hope that there is not this bad blood that I think the loud minority can make me think there is. And even with you guys, I follow you on Twitter and I see things retweeted or liked where I'm like, ooh, that's kind of mean, or whatever. It gives me this impression that it's pro-Blender, anti-Blender, whatever. So this is, I think we're already at a very good spot as far as the broader industries having a better perspective. The concept of Blender being used in a studio, a lot of different opinions. We have situations like Tangent Animation, RIP, where they use Blender primarily. And then that's probably the only really big one I'm aware of. I know there's a lot of boutique studios that use it as well. Jason, you're experiencing that firsthand. But I also think you guys coming from the industry see the very, very big issue with it is that so many tools are standardized already. Why would you throw all that out to start with Blender? Yeah, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about a hypothetical I would propose. If ILM or any of the top studios was forced to use Blender on their next project, right? Their next contract, just all the other software disappeared overnight, would they be able to get the job done, or would they actually fail to deliver?
I think they would fail to deliver. If we're just talking typical stuff that ILM would do, I think they would fail. If you just take vanilla Blender, the way that it is now, they would fail. You would have to build so much stuff on top of it, which I know you probably could. So it would be a long process of incorporating that into their new pipeline. But I think from where we are now, I don't see that happening. Just in terms of the massive data sets that you have to handle with the types of scenes that you render for film. I mean, over at DNEG, for example, using Clarice for rendering, to have to do that in order to have all the scatters and everything that goes on top of monsters, cities. I think the pure size of that, from what I've seen with Blender, and I'm not a super technical guy when it comes to that, it wouldn't be able to handle that. I mean, this is a pretty short answer for me, but I would love to hear from someone who might have helped a studio incorporate Blender. What have they seen, both in challenges and what have they been successful at?
I would say that you take nearly any program, vanilla, and drop it into any of those pipelines, they're going to fail on whatever deadline. So you have to have some sort of internal thing, even if it's just pipeline automation, so your artists aren't doing the same thing over and over and over again. So they're not doing admin tasks and they can actually focus on art. You're going to have some custom dev going in there. The question is, how much custom dev are you going to have to do to get that done? And can you get that done within a reasonable time frame? For a studio of that size with that much development muscle in-house, I would love to see some of that stuff happening and then shipped back upstream. I think that would be phenomenal, and I think we'd all be very surprised at what actually would come out of that. The only downside that is that when you're working within a studio environment, a lot of the times the code you produce is ugly and effective for a shot or a show.
Or just for the studio.
Right. And so generalizing solutions that are usable for more people, that's the challenge of pushing any of that stuff upstream.
I think it's actually a really interesting hypothetical, because I've been doing this hypothetical in my brain a few times. So let's say you were to ILM now, or let's say MPC DNEG. I never was at ILM. Let's say it's one of those big generic VFX studio. Let's say they're only allowed to use Blender for their production. They would very quickly run into issues where first you have purely collaborative tools. In modeling, you have to publish your model. You don't just save out a blend file or an OBJ file. You have to go through a model publisher. That stuff doesn't exist natively in any software. You need to develop that. All of them have that developed. But let's say all the pipeline stuff is sorted. You can pass data through and all that. Purely a fiction here doesn't exist. You need to build a custom. Let's just say for argument's sake that exists. Now, for modeling, you would probably be fine. You would need to build custom tools for a lot of different things for sure. You would need to use photo scanning tools or setting up images, image planes, all that kind of stuff. But in general modeling, you'd be fine. At least for if stuff isn't too large. But a polygon is a polygon, right? You would need some help with the UV tools. You probably have to add RISM to that. So none of them would all tear your hair out. But you can add that to it. But then you would start to go into the other departments. If you're dealing with animation. I'm not an animator, but I just talk to a lot of animators who are just saying that the tools are just not there yet. The rigging tools, talk to riggers who are saying the tools just aren't there yet. So then you would either have to develop a lot of tools, not just plugins, but probably core Blender stuff. And then even that, you can probably get to a point where you have that. But then you deal with specific things like muscle simulation and CFX stuff, all the character effect stuff. You would definitely need specific tools for that. So now you're going to be guys, let's just get Houdini. let's just get Houdini in for this. And then you would slowly but surely replace each part of the pipeline with more specialized tools. Like if you're dealing with effects, there's no way in hell you can do Blender for that. You need Houdini for that. All the studios used to have proprietary tools for that, and that's just been replaced by Houdini. So then you're dealing with that. And now you have to light your scene. So you need really good collaborative tools for that. Now, you probably want to deal with something node-based there because it's easy to just replace different shots. You have like a node group just for your lights. You have a group for your animations. And if you want to replace that, you just republish your animation, for instance, it goes in there. So I'm not sure how advanced geometry nodes is, but it's not tested for this. That's for sure. Like it's not tested at the scale for this. So now you're going to be replacing lighting with Houdini or with something like Katana. Pure render engine wise, you would be dealing with Clarice in Blender, which it really isn't tested like on a big scale, not to the degree of like something like RenderMan or Arnold, where the strength of RenderMan Arnold is not necessarily that they're crazy fast or anything like that. They're not. Like Cycles is way faster at a lot of stuff, but it's reliable. It's like a proper workhorse. You can basically throw anything you want at Arnold. Like I haven't used RenderMan, but anything you want at Arnold, and it's just going to do it. The tools are advanced. There's not going to be anything unexpected in this case. So now you probably have to introduce something like Arnold as well into the pipeline. And one by one, you just gradually replaced the tool that you were going with here, because you can't, like, let's say you're doing effects, you can't just quickly build the effects tools you need using Blender. It's just impossible. Like you have Houdini, which is 25 years old. It's fully refined as a tool. I saw this when geometry nodes came out. People online were talking about it. Cool, no need for Houdini anymore. But this would be like Houdini 0.5. It would be like a beta version for the first version of it. It's just so refined. So you would find that at the end of the day, you could probably end up doing a lot of your asset work in Blender. It would be fine. Polygon is a polygon. Anything until rigging, like concepting, modeling, that kind of stuff would be fine. For texture painting, you would absolutely need another tool. Like you could not texture paint professionally in Blender. It does have texturing tools, but you would absolutely need tools like Painter or Mari for that. They're just specialized in what they're doing. So at the end of the day, you just replaced everything. You left with a base of Blender where the only thing you're essentially doing now, you're using that as an asset tool, and now you would build some publishing tools and you would publish this like the Alembic or whatever, the USD into, and you would just pick that up in something like Houdini. And now that would be your main hub for something. The industry is actually moving away from Maya, not moving into Blender though, is moving to Houdini. People in the big studios are using Houdini all the time now. If we were both in VFX still, we would have had to learn Houdini now. They're using it for lighting, for look dev, for just general publishing, for all the shot work. And that's just because it's a highly specialized tool built for exactly what you want to do. Is Houdini a good tool if you're a little freelancer who needs to just do some quick shots and assets? Probably not, right? It all depends on a tool. I'm basically leaning towards what Morten was saying. If ILM was being given Blender and they had to just produce the same work, there's just no way in hell, particularly not with the scale of the assets and the collaborativeness and all that. Because the thing when you're in a production, it's not just that you have to make something that looks cool. You have to look something that looks highly specific. Like when we're doing with characters, like you need to move a forehead wrinkle from here to here and you need to control every single pixel on it. So that's really one of the things when it comes to the tools they're currently using, the established tools. It's not necessarily the speed, which is the advantage. It's all the boring stuff. When I'm thinking pipeline, I'm not thinking, oh, it's just a tool with some scripts. I'm thinking like a real mechanical oil pipeline with an oil rig and such. Like it would take as many years to replace an ILM pipeline as it would to build a British petroleum oil rig out in the North Sea here, right? In terms of how much time it takes, because they're massive multi-million-dollar operations. So yeah, that would be my take on that.
But also think about it from this point of view, like a lot of the specialized software that VFX houses use were literally developed for VFX houses by the companies that were developing. Take Arnold, for example. Arnold was developed in production, for production, and then they took it out and then started charging for it. Take Mari. They would always come in, talk to the studios, talk to the texturing artist. What do you need? What should we do? How should we improve the tool? So they do that. It's like an unfair comparison because these tools were like, they're so specialized for these specific purposes. Even Painter, for a lot of years, people were talking about, okay, Painter is going to take over from Mari. And Henning and I were like, but the tool's not there yet, And then slowly it started to get there. But I mean, Painter had to redevelop their entire texturing engine to sort of handle the data sets that Mari could handle, and it started doing things in a different way. So it's really hard when you have tools, they're not made for a broad spectrum of people that just either sit at home, pick up a free software, or even freelancers like, okay, let me do some 3D. No. They're made for VFX studios doing 100, 200 million plus dollar movies.
NPC had 17 at the same time when I was there, right?
Yeah, exactly. To compete with that. That's not to put Blender down. It could be developed. And if that's the direction that the community as a whole would want to take it in, it's 100% possible, but I think it's a waste of effort. Personal opinion here, but I don't think Blender should aspire towards becoming this like monopoly on the industry, quote unquote, to be like this amazing software that the VFX studios use. No, it should be in the hands of the people, the ones who like to use it, freelancers, people in studios as well, and people who just like to tinker.
And I think that sort of dovetails really nicely, because when you talk about 3D, media and entertainment is but a fraction of the applications of 3D. There's a lot of glitz, there's a lot of glamour, there's a lot of dollar signs for overall budgets. But in terms of where 3D can get used, and specifically where Blender has found its places to be used, there are so many other places that are different, I will say, than VFX. And I mean, you're not going to have necessarily the ability to serve all of those to the same degree of specialization unless you have in-house development sending stuff upstream. That's the only real way to make that even remotely possible. But until that point, you have a software that is general purpose that can be used in a whole bunch of applications, from 3D printing and rapid prototyping and manufacturing, all the way through to VFX and gaming and industrial visualization and architectural. I mean, there's so many different places it can be used. The second that you start focusing just on one part, and you do that without consideration for the other components of it, and that's where a lot of the community misunderstandings start happening, is that you'll have somebody who's in a particular industry and they're like, Blender doesn't suit my needs because it needs to be able to do this, and it's not a replacement for ZBrush. Well, it's not going to be a replacement for ZBrush, and it really oughtn't be a replacement for ZBrush. But if you happen to be doing something that needs sculpting and you don't want to jump into another application, guess what? It's there for you. It's not one application, right? It's basically an operating system for doing computer graphics. And every little area, every little editor is its own unique application. That's why technically every little editor, you can have different hotkeys that aren't consistent. Not great experience, but you could set it up such that, I mean, if you think about it that way, there's no reason why the video sequence editor has to use the same hotkeys and has to use the same interface paradigm as the rest of the application. If you wanted to build it as a straight up NLE, technically you could, and just use interfaces that are more familiar to that. But to be acceptable to a more general audience, there are trade-offs, standard engineering.
I do like to explain a little bit how the industry works when it comes to software. I really want to use Mari when Mari came out. It was developed at Weta, and one of the things they wanted to do with it wasn't to make this an incredible texturing experience or something. They're trying to solve a specific issue, that is, we need to get really, really close up to characters. And then in order to do that, it's not even talking about making the tools easy to use. You just have to get really, really close. And what you need to do, you need to develop new tools and methodologies which works with that. So then that was basically how the UDIM system was invented, where you can't just have one texture map that is 800K. It doesn't work. So instead you have a bunch of 4 or 8K maps, and those maps allows you to just get really close to the character. But the tool you need for that is, first you need UDIMs, but second off, you need to just develop something that can handle that level of data, because you're not again talking about fancy fill tools or procedure tools. You're just talking about, can I hand paint something that goes this close to the camera? Can I have a close-up of the eye? And Mari didn't have layers when it came out. Layers came in version 2, and even at that time you couldn't even run Mari in a regular computer. We could use Mari in third year of university. That was 2013. That was when they upgraded our PC to something beefy. Before that, it literally wouldn't be able to run on it. And that was not the intention, right? That's kind of explaining the level of things in film. This is specific to film, because when you're in film, the film is done forever. You do it once, you do Avatar once, and then it's there forever. You're not going to go back and redo shots or something. It's not an iterative software process. So they just want that thing to look really, really good in the beginning. And if they have to pay some more cash in order to make that shot better, they will do that. It's not about just making it have a fast turnaround. It really is fundamentally about making this thing look as good as humanly possible. And of course, within a budget, you have constraints and all that. But that's the main thing. You're not trying to just output assets as fast as possible. You're trying to really optimize for the quality. The amount of time you're spending on things in film is insane. On Pacific Rim, I think Morten has spent a year on the characters. It's insane. And that's because you need the close-up here, 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 and everywhere on the characters. It's a completely different way of working. And that's why, like Jason was saying, that we want Blender to go in that direction. You can either like scale like vertically and do one thing really well, or you can do it more horizontally and do multiple things. Let it be a good agnostic tool, refine some UX, make it the best it can. But if you're trying to compete with something like Houdini, Katana, Clarice, may you rest in peace, all that kind of stuff, then you're just going to spend all your resources in a place of very diminishing returns, because why do you want to when those tools already exist? The studios are just going to keep using Houdini. If you were to make a tool that was just as good as Houdini, they would be like, we're just going to keep using Houdini because it's just as good as Houdini. And you're not going to be able to make it as good as Houdini because there's such an advantage. Even then, if it's as good as Houdini, all the artists still know Houdini. So there's no impetus to switch. It's one of these things I keep seeing all the time. Like, one of the biggest misconceptions I think about Blender is that it's free. And yeah, the software is free. You can go and download 3.5 right away. But that's not free in a production, because you have to train people to use the tools. Like you were talking, could ILM just use the tool? Because first you would need to train people for 3 to 6 months just to use the tools, right? So you have that. That's a huge burden. You have to rebuild all the tools. And also you would lose a lot of jobs because there is no ecosystem of people who actually know how to use the tool. So if you were to have a production where let's say you're crewing up for a show, you're doing Fast and Furious like 15 or something, probably in space with some cars or something like that, then you can crew up for that. You can have 500 artists in a month if you use a Maya. If you have a Maya and Houdini pipeline, you're just going to be like, we're seeking 3D modelers and effects artists and lighters. And you can just like get them from the big studios. If you're doing the same thing in Blender, first off, these people, you would have to train every single person, or the people who already know how to do that. They probably would not be the people who's already used those tools professionally, meaning they haven't done it to the level required professionally because nobody's using tools professionally. So you might lose just out on the job by itself. So the free thing is like a bigger thing where, yes, the software itself is free, but the people you use to develop the tools with are sure as hell aren't free. Programmers are very expensive. The lack of jobs aren't free. The retraining absolutely is not free. So it's just a much bigger picture than just a price tag, for instance.
I think that also ties in nicely to what Jason was talking about before. For example, the way for Blender to grow, get better, is for studios to send stuff upstream that they've developed. But then you also have to think about, like, why would they do that? You have to have a very particular mindset. Say you're in the open source space. You're like, okay, I develop these things. It's free for everyone. But a studio that pours in 2,000 hours into building pipeline tools that is specific to their studio, what is their motivation to send it upstream, to release it for everyone? It doesn't really exist unless some exec in the company just loves open source and like, let's do this, let's get it out for everyone. That really isn't a concern for a studio. The studio is just concerned about, are we meeting our budgets? Can we deliver the shots? Yes or no? I think that's an important thing for people to understand as well, that you have to be on that side of open source in order to want to support that kind of growth.
Pipeline tools in particular are a tough one in general, because every individual and every studio is going to have their own way of doing things. And expecting a generalized, people have tried to make generalized pipeline tools and sell them in general. And it's like, this kind of does almost what I want to do, but it's still going to have to do something extra to it, right? So pipeline tools are a very specific sort of situation. But the other thing I'll say is, how many times in just this conversation have we said, may it rest in peace? That's one of those things where this notion of longevity and, when you have something that is in that realm, it can get pulled out from underneath. I've been looking at some mailing lists recently, and people are scrambling, trying to figure out what to do with the lack of a Clarice. And you'll see things along those lines and trying to figure out, all right, how do I scramble to handle that? And from a pragmatic standpoint, that is definitely an advantage on the open source side of things. It's like, look, I have this tool. I might not be able to maintain all of it. I can develop it and I can put some maintenance energy into it. Let's push this upstream so that at least it's available and I'm not locked out from using it later.
Yeah, for sure. Because a lot of the studios tend to lock you in, right? And that they provide support for your software, whether it be Clarice, Arnold, Mari. There's always that connect to the studio that's developing the software, so you have to go to them to get things fixed, bug fixes, whatever it may be. But again, there's a strength in Blender there.
The idea behind the hypothetical, just hearing you guys talk from your perspectives, it affirmed and both revealed problems with the hypothetical. I do think time is the issue. First, I would have said, I have no doubts that ILM, given how innovative they are, how they have revolutionized the industry and pushed it, like those artists, those technicians, those developers could absolutely take Blender and make it what it needs to be. But the upcoming contract is not enough time. Certainly. But I think I relate to the Blender community almost as like, why do I have this pipe dream? Or I wish I could say, Blender could be used. It's legitimate enough. It could be used in the right hands, to the highest level. It's a funny pipe dream. I have it too. I think maybe because that would be an ultimate sign of validation. I consider myself a proper CG artist. I want to say that I can achieve the highest levels of artistry in this field. And I don't want to think the tool I'm using can't achieve that. I wonder if that's shared by the community or if people can relate to that. But I think you guys are shedding a lot of light on the fact that it's not really here or there. Like, reality is not going to foster this happening. And one of the questions I had is about that is, with Tangent Animation, they're probably the only example of a bigger studio releasing a feature-length animated film using Blender primarily. But like, maybe we'll have studios attempt the risk, to do that kind of thing. But when it comes to the current ecosystem of professional studios, is the money savings, I think, Henning, you were kind of saying, it's not even there. To switch to Blender, it's not a consideration because we're talking much bigger dollar signs than that.
Yeah, in terms of the money, there would be primarily for modeling, rigging, or animation. And the rest you just would not do in Maya anyway. So it's not like you're saving even that much money on that in like an absolute sense, because you would still need to preserve your Houdini thing. Your Houdini license needs to be there. All the additional tools you just require. So let's say a CG artist cost you $60,000 a year, then you have rent and you have tools, you have to provide them hardware and such. It's expensive for them. And now you have a license for Maya for $3,000. Maybe they get bulk discounts. I have no idea what agreements they have, but if they have like 500 licenses, I would imagine they have some kind of discounts with them. So in that case, you aren't even saving that much money. Again, not compared to being able to get the talent at a moment's notice. Like, I live in London here. You could go to any pub in London, like 5 kilometers away, and find 400 artists who knows Maya, right? And you could plug them in right away, and you would find 3 people who was enthusiastic about Blender. It's just a completely different discussion about money, because it's so much bigger than just a software license.
But I would also say, to your point about the whole legitimizing the type of software that you're using, I would just say, like, for me, I've never been shamed for any tool that I've used online in the real world. People really don't care. If I show you cool stuff, they're like, okay, that's cool stuff. They might ask, what have you made it in? It's like, oh, I use this. I use Blender for that. I use ZBrush for that. Okay, cool. I think Blender is gaining a lot of traction, and I think it's gaining traction in the way that it should. That it's being popularized, it's getting out there, it's getting used by more and more people. I think that's just the way to go for the software. There's no maybe for you, for some other people, there is that, the ultimate dream of like, okay, we have the stamp of approval, we're being used in productions everywhere. But like Jason said as well, the industry, if we're talking about VFX, is not the only place where 3D exists. We have games, we have medical, visualization, ArcViz, all this stuff is also industry. Commercials is just a different industry. I think Blender has a place in all of them. It's just about finding the right ways to use the tool for the right job.
I've been using Blender professionally since before it was possible. But I will also sort of maybe disagree. I'll nuance a bit what Henning was saying, because it does depend on the size of the studio.
Yeah, in our case, we're assuming the studio has 1,500 employees.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that we sort of address that, because the difference in the licensing cost there could mean being able to hire another artist. And if you got to pay a little bit of money 1 year to train them, you still save that money subsequent years.
100%. Totally agree.
I worked with somebody in London at MPC, and then he went to a smaller commercial studio afterwards because it was a big layoff. And he was talking about like the MPC texturing pipeline, or like publishing pipeline, there was quite messy. It was quite hard to understand. And he was like, look, the one we have at this studio is so good. What you do is you export as TIFF, and then somebody imports the TIFF. And he was like, it's awesome, because that's the pipeline you're dealing with if you're dealing with like a 20-person studio, right? You don't need the level of, basically pipeline is there to remove the trust elements, right? And to move data forward. So if you were to do an MPC, some dude would delete that TIFF. And you're just in trouble. But that's why you build tools for that, so you can't do that. But for a 20-person studio, just export, right? Like, keep it simple. Completely agree with you, Jason. It's all about size. I mean, I'm a modeler and texture artist by trade. If I was doing this freelance right now, I would probably be having a suite of tools, which was Blender as my main thing for general modeling. I would probably be using Rism for UVs. Blender still for retop, or like retop flow, or just keeping it vanilla. Quite decent, actually. I know a lot of people complain. I think it's quite decent, to do in Blender, ZBrush for sculpting, and then you need a Painter / Mari for texturing. And then you basically have everything in terms of like as a one-person company. Like it's perfectly valid.
So that connects really well to what Morten was saying about people don't actually care about the software we're using. It's all about how cool is this thing? How good is this thing that you've created? And I want that to be true. And I'm encouraged that that's what your experience has been. I also would say that online, it does seem like it's always a badge of honor to post as many softwares that you used, or you post an artwork and you just have to put the B3D tag, or you have to put rendered with Arnold. Like there seems to be a long-standing, in my opinion, like over appreciation as if the tool is the main thing in this creation process.
This actually spins back into the question of why a studio would want to contribute anything upstream in terms of open source, right? Because there are still a lot of studios that think it's the tool that they use or that's tool that they wrote in-house that makes them special. Yeah, in some cases that help them meet a deadline or do things that couldn't be done at that moment. But what it comes down to is it's not necessarily the tool that's making them special. It's the artists and people who are actually using the tools in that house that are actually using them probably in ways they weren't originally intended or designed for to make them do things that need to be done. One of the things I personally would like to help studios understand more is that, yeah, I mean, it's their artists that are actually making these productions look fantastic. The tools are a means of facilitating that, and that's not IP that they need to leverage. That's not something that makes them over special.
You know, when I was starting out with 3D and in the first couple of years of 3D, I think there's a lot of loyalty just inherently. Also because I was younger, that might also factor into this. With the types of tools that I was using, specific brushes in ZBrush, I had these brushes in Photoshop, and these are the specific tools in Maya. And I think you tend to focus a lot on that. And I'm curious if that's what we're seeing, especially online, is that the louder voices, I mean, first of all, probably don't have industry experience, but also maybe they're newer to the tool and to the industry as a whole. And so they have a lot of opinions that might not be rooted in experience, and that can come off a little bit hostile and maybe kind of cultish. And I remember that for myself as well. I was 15, 16, 17, maybe I didn't know any better. That could be part of it. I don't know. I don't know what the general age gap is like with people here, but maybe that could factor into it.
Yeah, something with the tool, though, that is a very interesting discussion. Is it a tool or is it the artist? Obviously, at the end of the day, it is the artist. But at the same time, you're seeing CG from now compared to 10 years ago. It just looks much nicer because also the tools did improve. So it's absolutely not just the tool, or like not just the artist, but the whole thing. Like I'm dealing with a lot of students through Flip Normals. I just went to university last week as well, and so I deal a lot with them. And one of the things I'm always thinking about is like, what tool should you learn as an artist? Because there are a lot of people thinking like they're seeing on Twitter or other social media that, well, Blender can do everything I want to do, so therefore I'm just going to stick to Blender. And if you want to work in film, I think that's a little dangerous because yes, you can produce the model you need if you want to be a modeler. You can produce that totally, like to this exact same level in Blender as you can in Maya. Polygon is just a polygon. But at the same time, though, if you know the tool, it's just easier for you to get hired. Like it's just a purely practical matter that if you have 300 applicants and one of them can be plugged into a production right away. Of course, there are some proprietary things, but they can operate Maya right away in the production. Like it's hard to get a job in film and VFX. So the more advantages you have, just the easier it is. I mean, for games, this is a bit different because I know a lot of game artists are actually moving to Blender now because, again, Polygon is a polygon. If you can do that, it's fantastic, particularly with a lot of cool tools like what is called Decal Machine. A lot of these ones are actually better than Maya. But specifically, the caveat I would say here is if you want to be a film artist, particularly a modeling or asset artist there, particularly rigging or animation as well, the better you are at Maya or the tool they're using, you're just going to increase the chances of it. The studios are saying that, you know, we can't really teach you skills, but we can teach you software. And of course, you can also teach them skills to some degree. But I think, yes, they can. It's just so hard to get into the field. Eliminate every obstacle you can. Make it as easy as possible for them to hire you. I'm dealing with some students now who they've been working in Blender and they're producing gorgeous work in Blender. It's not like the work is any worse or better because of Blender. But then I'm recommending them like, okay, cool. Now you made your reel in Blender. Totally fine. Now, when you're done with your reel and you're just applying, just learn Maya as fast as you can. Like go through all the Maya tutorials, make as many projects as you can, just because then you can write Maya on your resume and They just know that you can do it. It's not even a case of like, oh, Blender is unprofessional, so you shouldn't have it. It's just they're using the tool. If you can do that, it's just faster to get you into the production.
I think I've been guilty, actually, of oversimplifying my recommendations to aspiring students. I think I oversimplify it to say it is, above all, the quality of your work. And studios know that. They're not going to care what software you use. But in this conversation, I think I have been made more aware of just how, cutthroat. I knew the industry was cutthroat. I went to school and everybody talked about it and was nervous about it. So I've experienced it a little bit, but then I also wonder if, the health of the industry causes it to be so cutthroat to the point that I think I would change my advice based on what you guys have said. Like you said, I think creating with whatever you want to, do that real, and then make sure you learn other software to be able to reduce the transition time once you get to a studio.
Yeah, it's not even if Maya is better or not than Blender. It's almost like you use tool X and the studio used tool Y. If it was the opposite, everyone loved Maya and they hated Blender. And the studios use Blender. They would be like, sorry, dude, you just got to learn the tool they're using. It's almost like an agnostic placeholder for whatever tool it is. You just got to learn the tool the studios are using. This specific studio you want to work for.
What I'll often do is I'll find out if the student has their heart set on film, right? If they have their heart set on film, then Henning's recommendation is exactly the way to go. But if I get the inclination that they're just really interested in 3D and wanting to do that, then I will steer them outside of media and entertainment altogether. It's sad to say, but outside of media and entertainment, you're going to be better paid, better appreciated, and probably not burn out as quickly.
Morten, one thing you said about the loyalty to software and seeing that online, I think you're right. And I am, again, very hopeful that the majority does not see it this way. From personal experience, I remember transitioning to Blender with a skeptical attitude in the beginning, just thinking like, this stuff is so hard, there's no way an open source software can do any of this legitimately. But one thing that I see on Twitter that started to be like a splinter in my mind leading to this topic is professionals with great resumes trying Blender and then complaining a lot about it. Like, I just was scratching my head because the industry taught me you have to transition software. You have to be good at learning software. That's just the way it goes. But the complaining confuses me because, there's plenty of quirks to point out about Blender, but I don't understand why that doesn't just go in the bag of, oh, that's quirky, but like just plow through transition. I don't need to take time to tweet about this.
Back in the day, right, when we were getting started with 3D and we'd been doing 3D for a few years, it was uncommon to just jump on a forum, because we didn't have Twitter, and just complain. Like if I was learning 3D Studio Max, I would ask a question. How do I render? It's not just saving an image. Oh, I actually need to render the image. Oh, that's stupid. Why do I need to do that? You would just ask a question and you get a reply. You might not like the reply, but like, how could I do it in any other way? But like, no, you have to do it this way. Okay, I guess I'll just accept it. Now you're older. Now you have engagement farm, aka Twitter, where if you post anything that's slightly controversial, okay, now you get more likes, you get more retweets, right? So if you try to transition to a software that's different from the one that you know, now all of a sudden you have an outlet for your frustration, which is just like on your thumbs. And I think it's just the way that society is nowadays, unfortunately, that there's a lot of ways to express this frustration, whereas in the past, it would have stayed in here. We would have complained about it to our friends, but unfortunately, now it just gets online and it probably exaggerates this image of industry people having something against Blender, is what I would say.
I think it's also to do with the fact that if you come from a commercial software, most of the commercial software today, they're actually quite tight in terms of the UX. Like, it might be a little clunky here and there, but it's an overall refined and quite consistent experience. Like, let's say you're in Maya, for instance, and you want to find a modeling function, like a extrude or something. You have basically three ways of finding that. You have like a shelf on top, or you have like a marking menu, and then you have a hotkey as well. So you can really choose between like three completely different systems. And this is all vanilla. So there's three completely different ways of finding it. And it's not like that's a messy way. It's just a flexible way of working. And then you come into Blender, and yes, you can find it through the menus, but you're really not going to go through the menus. You're going to use hotkeys. If I jump back into Maya, shift right mouse button, marquee menu, I can get everything I want from there. And it's not even a comparison like which one is best or not. It's just a case that Blender has a bit of a quirky UX. Like one weird one, for instance, the whole fake user workflow. Like for instance, if you were in any software ever made and you make materials, so you're doing a material pack like we've been doing with Fluxnomals. We have like a lighting scene and you drag your model in and you had a bunch of different materials. What you do, you just make a material and then you can assign one material to a bunch of different ones. You save your scene and it's fine. Do this in Blender. it deletes all materials that are not currently assigned to something unless you click the shield icon, right? And that's just a bit of a quirk. So like that was one of the things when I was discovering this, I was like, guys, there's a bug in Blender. What the hell is going on here? Oh, it's a fake user. Like it's an entire new concept that once you know about it, it's fine. But it is a bit of an awkward one. You just have to keep in mind. There are just a lot of weird things here with that. And particularly if you're not particularly hotkey based, then it becomes a bit of an awkward software to use. Like I have a MacBook and I use that for 3D. It's really hard because it turns out my laptop doesn't have a numpad. Right, so then you have to like remap a lot of stuff. Tons of keyboards today don't really have numpads. But like, yeah, it's a quirky software. And because it's a quirky software also means you can do amazing things with it. Like in Maya, you can't just turn any viewport into a rendered viewport. You have to bring up a rendered view and it's slow. And you can't just sculpt with real-time lighting or something. There is like viewport 2.0 from like the last 2 decades ago, like 2007 or something, right? Terrible. Yes, there are a lot of quirks, but there are a lot of like good quirks as well, right? That's one of the reasons why it's one of the best concept tools, probably the best concept tool ever made, because you can do that. And you literally can't do that in Maya. If you want a concept in Maya, sure, you can do all the same stuff in terms of modeling, some basic sculpting, all that. But just the look dev and rendering of part of it, it's just not the same thing. Blender feels like a tool from the future there. So like, yeah, pros and cons to it.
One thing that did happen with me personally with Blender was a little bit of a philosophy change. It was the first open source software I was convinced was really good. I was shocked whenever I did my first portrait in Blender and nothing was a huge hurdle. But I do feel like the industry approaches it maybe more legitimately, like, no, if we're going to look at Blender, we're going to put it on the same level as Maya or as any commercially developed software, and we're going to compare and contrast just like that. No grace, no grace to be had for the fact that this seems like a gift to everyone that might want to get into computer graphics.
I've never thought about it as an open source software. It's not something that I personally think about when I choose software, when I look at software. Like I've never been in the dev space really. So the whole concept of open source, even to this day, is like if I encounter something that's open source, I might read it, but I don't really internalize it. It doesn't do anything for me. I'm like, okay, it's a software. Okay, let's check it out. But I can see how, especially if you're really appreciative of the open source community being free, a lot of people develop for it, that you could then, reach the conclusion that you have, which is like, oh, okay, oh, sure. We'll give it a pass. But I think that doesn't jive with a lot of people that maybe use some of the bigger packages where they expect things to work in a certain way. Now they find the quirky Blender way, and then they might express some frustration with that. But not to say that, like Maya, Max, Houdini, they also have quirky solutions for things. It's just a way that some developer has decided to develop it. They're given a brief, hey, we need this feature. Okay, I'll figure out a way to implement it. But instead of going to Twitter to complain about it, they might have just, been like, yeah, okay, there's no changing it. Maya is just stupid with this viewport 2.0. Okay, that's never worked, but I'll just not use it then. I think people then just silently talk about the frustration at home or in their heads. They don't go to social media, but I don't know why we do that now. It's a weird thing.
I said this at the beginning, working with a lot of commercial and proprietary software, there's a very transactional sort of feeling, and I'm the customer and I'm always right. And if it doesn't serve what I need, I just move on because it's not what I need. There's a two-way street to this ownership conversation we were having earlier about Blender, in that it's free and you can do whatever you want. Therefore, I should be able to do whatever I want. And why can't I do whatever I want? And therefore, I'm going to complain. I mean, not even related to the free part of that, but there's that, okay, I'm part of this community now and my voice, I want to be heard. The question is, where's the most productive channel to put that energy into? The realization came to me. I ran into an issue with Blender doing something. This was years ago, so I can't remember what it was. But they were still doing development conversations on IRC, and so I jumped on an IRC channel. And I was like, blah 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 blah. I think this is broken, or maybe I'm doing something wrong. Right? Try to be a little bit polite about it. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, but I kind of think this is broken. And I got a response from the person who owns that code. It said, "Oh, yep, that's wrong. Oh yeah, by the way, I just fixed it. Check out the latest version. If you can figure out how to compile it, you got the fix." And that was in 10 minutes. There's something that happens also. You can actually know the name of the person and actually have met the person that made a particular code change. And it's not like, some like coding superstar or whatever. They're a person. And so I think part of Kent's grace, at least the way that it works for me, is that I know that person who wrote that code. They're kind of quirky too. I'm going to give a little grace to that as well. The fact that I even know who that person is, and anybody here could get to know that person, is an unfair advantage that Blender has over other software.
I think that's an interesting point because I've never sort of made that connection before. And I think then more and more it's starting to make sense why a lot of people that use Blender and have used Blender for a long time can be very vocal, right? Because like if you're using ZBrush, for example, you don't have a say. I mean, yeah, you can blast about things on a forum and maybe in 5 years, a feature that resembles something you talked about will get implemented, but probably not. Whereas with Blender, it's very direct, it's very one-to-one. You know, you file a bug report, you talk to someone, and then, like you say, maybe 10 minutes later or in 2 months, a feature exists. You talk to someone on Twitter, now a feature exists. That will give you some kind of ownership feeling. Even if you don't propose a change, but you just talk to people about things you could do, you have a community about it, that also gives you like a sense of ownership. So I definitely see why that would come to light in that way. I've never thought about it that way before, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we're just mad at all software.
We hate them all. We hate them all.
Yeah, I've been using ZBrush since 2006, right? This is a very long time. And as my main software, I've been using that for thousands of hours, and I'm still mad at ZBrush. It's the quirkiest software of all time, even way quirkier than Blender. At least Blender has some standardization in most ways. ZBrush is just like out there on this kind of stuff. And like when we're using Maya, it's not, nobody enjoys using Maya. We accept Maya. It's fine. It's just a tool. Like we really don't care of like, I'm just a ball of anger using any of these tools, right? Like if you're using Maya or some other tool, chances are that the person who's using that has experience with a plethora of different tools. Maybe like they've been using Softimage, Modo, Max, whatever, and they've just been around. But the problem is that a lot of people who use Blender have only ever used Blender. So if you're proposing something that's an entirely standard UX feature or something, the response is like, why would you want to do that? And you have to like explain really in depth why this kind of thing is done in that way when it's an entirely standardized thing. It's a little bit like the left click, right, in which button is the actual main clicker. Left click is just the standard thing, and it's a bit of a weird one. So you have a lot of these quirks, I think, because a lot of the, not even necessarily quirks in Blender, but like in the discussions, that you have people who come from just standard UX land, like Microsoft Word would have it, Google Sheets would have it, and then it's just standard software UX, and then Blender is just like, nope, we do it a different way. That can be like a pretty frustrating thing as well, like being a part of the community, simply because people just haven't experienced that. We saw that actually for the first time when we were learning Blender. Like I started learning Blender in 2019, and that was the first time I saw tutorials that were wrong. Like that's something I hadn't actually seen before. I was watching tutorials on like modeling or something, and if you're watching a Maya tutorial, it's just fine. It's just showing you how you do it, and it's maybe efficient or not efficient, but at least it's the correct way of doing it, because these people probably had some kind of experience with some kind of feedback from the commercial market, right? If you model in the wrong way and you're in a studio, somebody's going to tell you right away because the method just doesn't work. But if you're modeling in Blender, you're just doing stuff for yourself. You've just been a hobbyist since you were like 14 years old, and you're just building stuff in your bedroom as a kid, and you just keep doing this as a hobby. You never like iterated on your skills. One big example here, for instance, is like you shouldn't model with the subdivision surface active, because then if you turn it off, then the whole model is just like exploded, right? It's just impossible to work with any kind of rigor or anything without the subdivision surface. So you model without the subdivision surface modifier, and then you add that to check it. But if you're just working for yourself, who cares, right? Like then it's like, does it look good in a shot? Fine. But if you're working in a professional environment, it's just like a non-negotiable thing. It's just wrong to model with that, and there's 10 reasons why that's wrong. So that was like a weird thing I saw when we first started with Blender, that a lot of the tutorials were excellent in terms of documenting the specific features, but the workflows themselves were actually not particularly good. A lot of times was like, wait, this is not how you model something. It's not even like an opinion. It's just like, this is just factually just an incorrect way of doing it. And I think that also comes from people haven't necessarily had professional experience in the field.
I would say that I'm frankly jazzed because, we've approached this from several angles. And what I have learned is I don't think I had enough industry experience to really understand just how monumental of a feat it would be for Blender in its development ecosystem for it to displace what has been standard for so long. That has changed, my perspective. I would hope and, offer this to people listening. If you're inclined to complain, maybe just give it a little more time, put that letter in the drawer, then decide later if you're going to tweet it or share it. But yeah, do you guys have any final words to people listening, how to go about this topic online in a healthier way?
Oh, that's a big one, right? I mean, I'm with you there in terms of the whole task that Blender would sort of have in front of it in order to I hate the term, but become industry standard. But also, I'm still of the mindset, would you want that? It really depends. But I think a lot of people probably share your view there, or not view, but more like, no offense, but let's call it inexperience, because if you haven't worked in a huge VFX production, you might not be aware of all the different tools and all the different steps of the pipeline. So when you look at Blender from the outside, or I guess from the inside, you say, well, I mean, it could do everything. We can model, UV, rig, we can light, render, texture, sculpt, comp, everything. Yeah, you can. But when you compare it to specialized tools that are outside of a main software package that a company has co-created with VFX studios over the course of 10, 15 years, I feel like it's only reasonable that you sort of understand that it's really hard to compete with. But also, again, is that something that you want? I mean, for me, I think Blender is right where it should be, and it can continue and it can grow, gets into the hands of more 3D folk. I think that's the strength of Blender, is introducing people to 3D. They have a free option that allows them to explore this wonderful world that 3D is. And not just explore, but I mean, they could become professionals in it. But they can then also add other tools to their tool belt, so to speak. ZBrush, Mari, Painter, whatever. Just embrace all of 3D. I have no feedback as such or any suggestions for people being more cordial online. I think it's just an unfortunate way that the world is right now. So maybe in the future it'll sort of just fix itself. But unfortunately, this is the world we live in right now.
Yeah, I would say when it comes to like all the online discourses, people are nicer in real life than they are online. And if you were to just remove the either ends of the extreme, if you just were to cut away the 95 and the 5% mark, everything is so much nicer. So if you're on social media, just mute a lot of people. Just like remove them from your existence. Life becomes a lot nicer then. That was something I had to do when I started with Blender. There were a lot of mean voices there, a lot of angry people. But then the second one is just if your only experience is with Blender and you want to learn more about 3D, try some different software. Try Max, try Maya. Yeah, they're old and they're clunky, but there's a lot of really, really good stuff in those software. Try out Houdini, particularly if you're interested in like contributing to the development of Blender. Like just give them a shot to see what solutions there are there. All these tools are old, but they've solved a lot of things. And like Morten said, they've been through productions time and time again. They've solved a lot of issues. It's like when we're building Flip Normals, right? Like Marketplace. There are other websites that have solved marketplaces before. There is no reason for us to reinvent absolutely everything from scratch. See how other people have solved highly technical problems before in terms of UX. Also, like there are a lot of cool stuff that other software do as well. Like there's just a whole different world out there. If you want to learn to sculpt properly, try ZBrush. Like ZBrush is a fantastic tool. If you want texture, try Painter. There is a reason these tools are so specialized, and they're awesome tools. They're all with their own quirks and issues, of course. But yeah, there's a big world outside of the pure Blender ecosystem. While that is a very mature ecosystem at this point, just play around, have fun, and learn more about 3D, tinker with a lot of different things. And yeah, just have fun with that.
Henning, you mentioned try these other softwares, and I'm like, yes. But then I thought, well, they are accessible, right? We can just try Blender, download it for free. We can just do that with Painter. We can do that with Houdini. They have free educational options for all these softwares, right?
Yeah, Houdini has the Apprentice. Painter does not. None of the Autodesk tools have versions like that. They have 30-day free trials. This is something a lot of people don't know about the Autodesk tools. So they do have the indie versions. They're like $200-300 a year. So if you make less than $100,000 a year, you can get it for that. You know, that's a pretty steep price for that. And that's one of my complaints with the Autodesk tools. If they want to, you know, stay alive over the long term, those guys are going to have to take some drastic steps because they are bleeding customers by the hour to both Blender and Houdini, right? So yeah, it's not just as easy as you can't just go to Maya.com and just download Maya. It's more involved than that. But if your goal is just to play around with them, 30 days, which is the length of the trial, is plenty enough to get an idea of how it works. We have a bunch of tutorials on Flip Normals as well, like on our YouTube channel. But yeah, like that's enough to play around with that. But yeah, Houdini, I believe, has a full free version you can use.
So I'm going to address the talking on the internet part of things. There's a sentence I like to tell when moderating forums, and I tell this to my children. Other people are allowed to be wrong. That's the underlying base. But the other part of that is that if you're going to, what Morten was saying, these UX things and these refinements have happened because a team of people have put that time and effort into doing that. Blender's been getting a lot of investment and been getting a lot of people involved. The development team has gotten larger, but it's still not super large. We are that team. If you want to see changes happen, you've got to be involved, and you've got to be involved as a human being on the channels where it happens. Being involved on Twitter doesn't count. Be on projects.blender.org, be on blender.chat, talk to developers, show up at SIGGRAPH or the Blender conference and actually talk to these people as human beings. And chances are good, one, they're well aware of the problems. You don't have to spend your time venting about the problem. It's not just obvious that it's got to work this way, right? Everything's a trade-off, and everything has a reason for being the way it is. And sometimes it's just because no one's touched it in a while. Okay, well, that's easy enough to fix. Sometimes it's that way for a reason because other things are chained to it, or because that's part of the design vision. But you don't know these things unless you actually have those conversations and get involved with people where it's actually happening. It also sort of goes to, if you're an artist and you want to get work as an artist, you kind of need to post your art where art is being posted and people are looking for it. If you don't do that, you might not get a whole lot of work because they don't know to look for you. Same sort of thing in terms of getting development done. If you're going to do it, you got to meet them halfway and go on their terms and, be civil.
Well, gentlemen, again, thank you for this. I appreciate your honesty and your groundedness, too. I'm so glad you weren't the personalized voices of the stuff we see on Twitter. But this was great. I had a blast talking with you and learning from you. Thanks again to Henning and Morten and Jason for joining this conversation. I think it was a great way to finish the first season of the podcast. Denoise is a bit of an experiment, so if you like what you've heard and you'd like to hear a season 2, please leave a review on your podcast player. If you're interested in leveling up your Blender skills and supporting what we do at CG Cookie, check out our extensive library of courses on cgcookie.com. Likewise, you can learn from Henning and Morten at flipnormals.com, and if you own a business or you're part of a business interested in onboarding Blender, make your way to orangeturbine.com. That's all for today. That's all for Season 1 of Denoise. Thank you so much for listening.